Hi students, now we are going to discuss 8255. So that is a programmable peripheral interface. So this IC it is mostly used in microprocessor for interfacing with the input and output devices. And this IC that is also called as a parallel interface. So this 8255, so it is a 40-pin IC. In this 40-pin IC, it is having a 24 pin that is to be altered for an input and output lines. So this it is to be divided into port A, port B and port C. So port A it is having an 8-bit that is to be using as a port A, and the port B that is to be using an 8-bit port, that's an 8-bit starting from this 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. So these 8 pins that is to be used for port B. And port A we can use as 1, 2, 3, 4 and 40, 39, 38 and 37. So that is to be used for a port A. And the remaining pins we can using as a 10, 11, 12, 13 and we can using 15, 16, 17 that is to be using for a port C. So each pin that is to be using for a 8-bit port, and apart from that, that is to be using as a read operation and write operation and a reset. So for this we are using a remaining pins. And for this a port we can using as that is to be divided into two groups, group A control and group B control. So for this group A control, under this group A control, it is having a 8-bit port we can use as a port A. So that is to be using from the PA0 to PA7, and we can using a port C. Port C that is called as an upper port. We can use from the PC4 to PC7. That is to be using as an upper port. And here if we can come into a group B, so the group B contains a 8-bit port. We can using as from PB0 to PB7, and a 4-bit a lower port we can using from the PC0 to PC7. So this port we can using as a upper port and a lower port. That is a group A control. So these two we can using as a group A control, and these two we can using as a group B control. So this group A control and the group B control we can using for a interfacing purpose. From here the input and output port we can using as a parallel interface, and from this PA7 to PA0 that is to be directly connected to a input and output devices. Suppose if you want to transfer the data, so we can using this and we can transfer into input and output devices. So this is a port A and a port B. So this is we call this two groups, group A control and group B control. So through the group A and group B we can transfer the data. Here we can using this a bidirectional bus. So this bidirectional bus we can be interfaced with a microprocessor system, and these are read and write controls. The read and write controls, so what operation we have to be used, whether the read operation or write operation. So these two operations that is to be controlled with a read control and a write control. These both that is to be acting as active low signals. So there is a bar in the upper side that is to be acting as active low signals. So this active low signals, what is operation? Whether the data which can transfer from the input and output devices to microprocessor, that is called as a read operation. If the data that is to be transferred from the microprocessor to the input and output devices, that is called as a write operation. So it can able to, this is a control signal. This control signal that is to be identified that what is the operation, whether it can use for a read operation or it can use for a write operation. So these two control that is to be decided by the controller. And so here we have to be using as a data bus buffer. So this buffer that is to be interfaced with the 8086 interfacing with respect to this microprocessor. So these two that is to be connected by using a data bus buffer that is to be interfaced between the microprocessor and the input output devices. So this it can acting as a interface ICs between the input and output devices and the microprocessor. So in between this we have to be using this 40-pin PPI programmable peripheral interface. Suppose if you want to transfer the data through this port A, so the data from the input and output devices that can transfer through a port A and it is transferred into a microprocessor. through whether it can be using a group A control or group B control. So based on the any one controls, so the data which can able to transfer through a group A. Suppose if you want to transfer group A control means, so through the group A control, the data which can transfer into a microprocessor. Or if the data want to transfer from the microprocessor into an input and output devices means, what is the devices we have to be using? Whether it can be using as an out operation, that is for a write operation. So through which port we can use, whether the group A, port B or port B or port A, port B or port C. So through that, the data from the data bus buffer, it can transfer through an internal bus, and through this it can able to transfer into a group B control. If you want to transfer through a port B, means the data which can transfer into a port B. So like that, so this data transfer which can able to take through this 8255 microprocessor PPI. So now, how the data which can transfer? So based on the data transfer, there is a two mode of operations that is to be using. The one is a bit, set and reset mode. That is called as a BSR mode. The next mode that is called as the input and the output mode. So in which mode the data which can transfer? So whether it can be using a BSR mode and the input and output mode. The input and output mode, that is we further divided into three types. It is having mode 0 operation, mode 1 operation and a mode 2 operation. In the mode 1 operation, that is to be using for basic input and output control we have to be using. And a strobe input and output control, that is to be using a bidirectional input and output control. Normally that is to be using a basic and input and output control. We can transfer data transfer between the microprocessor and the input and output devices. So this, how the data that is to be transferred. So according to a control word format. The control word format, it is an 8-bit register. So this 8-bit register, that is a programmable register. So we have to be programmed before the data transfer. So which port that is to be used? So these are your data, that is a D0, this is an LSB, this is an MSB. So from the starting from LSB to MSB, we have to be programmed, we have to be assigned the data. So the last one, the D7, that is to be identified that what mode we can use, whether it is to be using a input and output mode or BSR mode. Suppose if this D7 is a 1, that is a high signal, that means that it is to be using as an input and output mode. If the D7 is 0, that is to be acting as a BSR mode. Now suppose if you want to go for the input and output transfer operation, this D7 bit, that is to be an 1. It is to be identified that we can use an input and output mode. Suppose for example, if you are using this D7 is a 1, you can using an input and output mode. Now we can using that what mode of operations we have to be used. Suppose if you are using a input and output mode, a basic input and output mode, at the time these two bits, D6 and D5. So these both that is to be as 0, 0. When it is both are 0, 0, that means that it is a mode 0 operation. If it is a 0, 1, that is a mode 1 operation. If it is a 1, 0, that is a mode 2 operation. So these two bits, D6 and D5. And the D4, it is to be acting as what is a mode of operation. Whether if you can using the port A, the port A we can using as whether it is acting as an input port or it is acting as an output port. It's an input port. If it is an input port means it can use during a read operation. If you want to go for a read operation, so this it is acting as an input port. So at that time, so this D4 bit that becomes 1. If it is acting as a writing port, that means that the data transfer from microprocessor into the input and output devices. That is a writing operation. During the writing operation, this D4 it becomes 0. So based on that, we have to be decided that so what is the port of operations we have to be used, whether the port it is acting as an input port or it is acting as an output port. And this D3 bit, that's the same thing, we have to be using as a port C. See, if you can see this in a block diagram, all this port A and port B, so these two ports, it is acting as an 8-bit port. That is an individual port. And if you can see this port C, the port C that is to be divided into, from starting from this LSB to 4-bit, that is called as a lower bit. From the MSB to the 4-bit, that is called as an upper port. So the port C, it becomes a 2 port, lower port and upper port. that is to be divided into there. So the port A and the port C upper, these two that is acting under the control of a group A control, and the port B and the port C lower that is come under a group P control. So what port we have to be using, whether it is using an upper port or lower port, this is also the same thing. Whether the port that is to be using as an input port or the port it is using as an output port. So according with that, so what port we have to be using, and here we have to be using a mode selection. So this mode selection, what is a mode, whether it's using a mode 0 operation or mode 1 operation, and a D1 this is for a port B, and this port B control we can using a group B controls, and here we have been using group B control. So the D1 and D2 and D2, D0, D1, D2 that is to be using for a group B control. And what this is also what is operation, whether the port B that is to be using as an input port or it is to be using as an output port, and D0 that is to be using as an input port or output port. According to that, we have to transfer the data. So in which port of the operation, in which mode of the operation, the data is to be transferred. For example, if you want to use this in input and output mode, and this that is to be using as a mode 0 operation, and that is to be using as an output port, and here we have to be using, this is also port C is also an output port. So at the time here this becomes a 1, and this is a 0 0, and this is also 0. So 1 0 0 0 that becomes an 80, and this remaining we have to be using an output port mode 0 operation. This is also output, this is also output. So all the bit that is goes into 0 0 0. So now if you can convert this an 8 bit into a digital data, so it becomes an 80. So the 80 this is an hexadecimal code. So if you want to program, if you want to register, if you want to store a control word register, we have to store. So what is here the value? So this value we can give, if you can give the value 80, that means that it is to be using an input and output mode, and we have to be using a mode 0 operation. And this port A it becomes an output port, and port C it is also an output port, and the mode of operation we have to be using the mode 0 operation, and these two, port B and the port C lower. So both this port it is acting as an output port. So this one, the control word register, that is to be decided that in this block diagram, so what is a mode of operation? If you are using this port A, port B, port C, these three ports, in which mode that is to be used, whether it is to be using an input mode or it is to be using an output mode. This one that is to be decided by using this control word format. Okay, so now if you can view this video lecturer, now we can view the conclusion is, now see what is now we discuss what is a pin diagram of 8255. It is having 40 pins. So this type of the IC that is called as a dual in-line package IC, that is called as a DIP IC. And what is the mode of operations? We have, what is a pin diagram, and what is the different pins we are using? So these are in a database D0 up to the D7. This is an 8-bit database we use. The next topic we discuss. So what is a block diagram of 8255? The block diagram that is to be divided into group A and group B controls. So how the block diagram that is to be using, that is to be working. So we discuss. The next one is here. So what is here? A control word format of 8255. The control word format we discuss. So what is here? Two mode of operations we have to be used, and the bit set and reset mode that is to be using for set and reset of the microprocessor that is to be used here, individual port we are using, and this one we are using here a control word format. So what is the principle of control word format? So how this control word format, what purpose we are using? That is used for transfer the data from microprocessor to input output devices, and in which port that is to be using, we decide. Okay, thank you.